too. So welcome and thank you all for being here today. We'll just start with our land acknowledgement, opening the convening by recognizing that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people, the traditional home of all the tribes and the bands within the Duwamish, the Suquamish, the Tulalip, and the Muckleshoot nations. And of course, that's just an acknowledgement, but we invite you all to find your own way to honor the tribes. And then we're just going to do some quick personal introductions, and that's going to be super fast as people are just going to come on in. So Bambi Chavez, and I'm the Member Programs and Services Coordinator here at HDC. I'm going to be the pretend patience today as she went to a conference and is in travel. And so I'll be helping out at the beginning of the meeting here. And then if you have any questions, always reach out to me. And then we'll just go through and I'll just go ahead and call down so that it's a little faster. Steve and Sandra are both going to be presenting. So Sandra, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Sandra Mallory, the Buildings and Energy Program Manager for the Seattle's Office of Sustainability.
And Steve?
Steve Gelb, the Northwest Regional Director at Emerald Cities Collaborative, he, him pronouns.
And then Alistair, you're not going to have to present today, but we'll go ahead. You're part of the team here, so you're next.
Hi, yes, Alistair Jackson with O'Brien 360. I'm part of the technical team, and he, him pronouns.
All right, and then Ellen.
Hi there, I'm Ellen with Community Roots Housing, Capital Projects Program Manager, and she, her pronouns.
And we'll go with James.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. I'm James Hill. I'm the Director of Facilities at Catholic Housing Services.
And then Bobby.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bobby Coleman, Sustainability Administrator at Seattle Housing Authority.
And we have Jennifer.
Hello, I'm Jennifer Lebrecht with the City of Seattle Office of Housing.
And Madeline.
Hi, Madeline Kostich with Seattle City Light.
And then we have Daniel.
Dan Boyle with the City of Seattle Office of Housing, Multifamily Weatherization.
And then Ariella.
Hi, everyone. Ariella Marin, supporting NRDC and the City of Seattle as part of the American Cities Climate Challenge.
And then we're like a little intimate group right now, and it may grow as we move forward. Some people had conflicting appointments and we're going to be coming in a bit late. So we'll just let people roll in as they go. I'm going to share my screen and just quickly go over the agenda. So I'm just going to do that quick agenda review and then a quick timeline review. Then at 2:15, Sandra will go ahead and talk to us about a few things, what they have learned over at OSE from their May 18th meeting with the mayor, what happens with the recommendations we've been working on once we send those out, where we see potential funding sources, maybe like a 35,000 foot perspective on that, as well on the current policy draft that OSE is working on. And if we have room, we'll have a little bit of discussion or Q&A around any of those items. And then at 2:30, and for the remainder of the meeting, it's pretty much going to be kind of like a work group. So we're going to just make sure that we have captured all the concerns and benefits in our policy recommendations. And Steve has a number of different aspects to the conversation that he has delineated. So we'll make sure that everything looks thorough and people feel like it's reflecting the conversations that we've had. So without further ado, we'll go ahead and just get into our business and see how far we can take it. And so Sandra, you're up.
Sure. So hello, everyone. So just, for those who may not know, we, our process for developing a policy proposal is that, we generate proposals at the department level, and then we bring it up through the mayor's office to get confirmation that it is in fact something they want to proceed with. So we have briefed both the mayor's executive team and then Mayor Harrell directly, and they are all very supportive of moving forward with legislation this fall for building performance standards for Seattle buildings. And so at this point, we will continue to develop legislative language with stakeholder input. We are holding our second public open house tomorrow, which I'm hoping folks will be at. And we'll be presenting more details about our process and the proposed policy framework and getting more input. We are waiting on confirmation from the mayor's office about the specific timing about when legislation would get introduced at council. The mayor's office submits legislation to council and then council reviews it. So, but we do still expect that'll be introduced this fall. And, Housing Development Consortium has provided us with some draft recommendations and will be providing us with final recommendations. And that, in addition to all of the other stakeholder feedback we're getting, essentially gets incorporated into a draft framework. So what we're presenting tomorrow and what we've been proposing to the mayor's office is kind of the high level draft framework of where we're going. And then, we take input that we are going to get from folks tomorrow and follow-up input that we will get in the next few months and HDC's specific recommendations, and then we create a preliminary draft of the legislation. We will then share that draft with key stakeholders like Housing Development Consortium, so as well as our city partners, and we'll be doing that in July. So we'll work with Patience and Bambi about how you all can be engaged in that. And then once we get further input, we will refine that legislation. It will get reviewed by the legal department, transmitted to the mayor's office, who will then transmit it to council, and which is always an opportunity for public input, just noting that the council process on any legislation is an opportunity for public input. And just also noting that part of our process is legislation, and part of our process is, we've talked a lot about the need for support programs, and some of that comes through the work that OSE does around the city budget process, where we convey our budget interests to the mayor's office, and the mayor will be putting together their proposed budget that goes to council typically in late September, and then the council deliberates on budget. So that is just noting that's also an opportunity through input for public, through public hearings on the budget process. And, Bambi had asked about, how are we incorporating the Housing Development Consortium recommendations? And so it is essentially in the legislation as we develop the legislation and in our budget asks to recommendations to the mayor's office. But I do also want to note that, Housing Development Consortium, the task force, is free to share your recommendations directly with the mayor's office or with council members. And so, OSE is incorporating that input, but you can also share it at any time with your elected officials. So one of the, I mentioned a key component of recommendations that you are providing is the need for funding and assistance, especially for affordable housing providers. So just outline a little bit where things stand there. I think I've noted to this group that we are launching what we're calling a Clean Buildings Accelerator program later this summer. We have Stillwater Consulting on board to help with that. It's a small program at this point. We have $200,000 a year in funding, and it's prioritized for under-resourced building owners, nonprofits, affordable housing, and initially to help folks comply with the state's energy standards, but also to allow people to prepare for Seattle emissions reduction standards. We also have some funding that's been reallocated from previous ARA funds that are going towards engineering and actual direct capital funds for efficiency and decarbonization upgrades in 2 to 3 affordable housing projects. We have a pending application into the Department of Energy that would fund capital, again, basically grants for 3 to 5 affordable housing projects. And we're really closely tracking the federal infrastructure funding opportunities, and the expectation is that those opportunities get announced this fall. And so we would be seeking funding either directly through the federal Department of Energy, or some of that funding might go through the state. And then lastly, I just want to note that, as many of you may already know, the Green New Deal Oversight Board is providing recommendations to the mayor's office on how to spend Jumpstart funds, a portion of Jumpstart funds. And they have recommended a staff position for the Clean Buildings Accelerator to grow that to a much more robust and extensive program, again, prioritizing nonprofits, affordable housing, and buildings serving BIPOC and lower income communities, as well as starting in 2023, additional funding, capital funding, and engineering support funding for $4.5 million a year to support these projects to actually make the upgrades. So that is that funding proposal, and that recommendation will go for 2023, will go through the mayor and council budget process, and there's always opportunity for input there. And then I'm just going to touch briefly on the policy framework that we are proposing at this point. We'll go, like I said, we'll go into much more detail tomorrow in the public open house. But some of the highlights just that, I think are most relevant to this group. One, noting that we are not proposing that we duplicate the state's efforts to regulate energy performance. So the state is regulating energy performance for initially larger commercial buildings, but then also that will include over time multifamily buildings and smaller commercial buildings. So we are proposing that at the Seattle that we implement greenhouse gas emissions targets. Energy efficiency always remains a critical means to get emissions reductions. And for cost-effective electrification of equipment, such as domestic hot water heating, but we would establish targets for greenhouse gas emissions. And these would be annual greenhouse gas per square foot, but with some normalization factors for multifamily that take into account the varying size ranges of units. And so it might be normalization by occupant or by bedroom. That's still to be determined. And then just, in terms of timing for compliance, we are proposing that affordable housing would have a longer ramp up period. So that while market rate multifamily housing would have to meet their first emissions targets beginning in 2031, affordable housing wouldn't have to meet any targets until 2036. And that, for nonprofit owners of portfolios of buildings, that, the provider could comply based on the portfolio as a whole, as opposed to by building size, which would allow more flexibility in determining which buildings to focus on, depending on your particular asset management needs. And so just, again, those are a couple of the highlights that pertain specifically to affordable housing, but we will go into more detail tomorrow. So I will just pause there for questions, comments. What didn't I cover? What are you curious about? Steve.
Hi, Sandra. Thanks. I had a question about funding and policy. So, and how they can they be linked, and how they can be linked. So as you mentioned earlier, having the support services available for housing in general makes a BPS work or not work well for the affordable housing community. So is this, I know like in the state, there's a fiscal note that comes with policy that says if we pass this policy, this money goes along with it. Is there a provision like that in the city to where it says if we pass this policy, X amount of funding must be allocated or identified for that?
Yeah, so we do a fiscal note similar to the state, and that basically says, you know, it's like, this is what it would require to put this policy in place, and part of that would be to fund a support program. So it does in fact go, being a little cautious because it goes along with the legislation that is reviewed, but it's not specifically called out in the legislation. It's in the fiscal note, and then the budget office approves that fiscal note. And then, and in this case, depending on when the legislation goes through council, we may actually pass budget before the legislation. And I know, you know, the state in its incentive program that they created was, you know, that was named in the legislation. We're actually talking to law about that because it's, you can't really name something in legislation until you know you have the funding, right? So we're working it primarily through the fiscal note.
Any other questions coming up for anyone?
Another question, and we might just, since we're going to be discussing this later, I thought I'll ask the question of Sandra and maybe get into the discussion right now. It's around compliance timing. Mm-hmm. There were questions about that. So I understand that delaying compliance timing for affordable housing is intended to make it easier or less onerous for affordable housing. But since almost all, and correct me if I'm wrong, Alistair, most of the equipment we're looking at, talking about to comply, especially for electrification and carbon reduction, has, you know, a 15-year or longer life, that anything that needs to be installed today would exist in 2036. So am I understanding that correctly? That if and I understand that that there would be a ramp up of requirements, I imagine, for emissions. So depending on where you're starting in 2036 and how fast it ramps up, that it, you know, I imagine some buildings could bump up against that immediately and need to be responding right away to comply with 2036 or beyond. So that's one of the issues we want to sort of talk about today, was that whole timing issue. And it may need the specifics to really understand it. I don't know, but maybe you can discuss it in general and we can open it up for more discussion.
So I'm not sure I'm completely understanding the question, so I'll take a crack at it and then you can fill me in. But so the idea, you know, we would be setting emissions targets, you know, starting from a baseline in 2019 and down to net zero emissions in 2045. And then, you know, those targets ramp down from, you know, the baseline to zero. And then compliance comes in at various points along that ramp. And you're absolutely right. I mean, if an owner is going to be replacing equipment now, one of the reasons that it's important for us to convey what's happening and get legislation on the books and get the rule in place, even if someone isn't complying until 2036, is so that there's awareness that is what is going to need to happen. So if a piece of equipment needs to be replaced now, then we know. And in addition, the Seattle Energy Code impacts multifamily buildings over 4 stories or larger. And, you know, according to the Seattle Energy Code, that equipment should be, if it's a gas equipment, for instance, a gas hot water heater, that should be replaced with electric equipment per code in any case. And so there's, there are exemptions, exceptions to that, but that's part of the idea, is that wanting to make sure that folks are aware of what's coming so that decisions that are made now. And one of the things we're also proposing is that even if you don't have to comply until 2036, you're still doing benchmarking verification, and we're, some simple level of identifying what's in your building, like documenting what's in your building and where you're going to need to know. We don't want people to get caught out with this, in 2035. And so starting in, in that first compliance cycle, 2026 to 2030, reporting to the city, like, what is the equipment in your building that's going to need to be changed out? So people are, it's more of it's a fine line between not wanting people to have to fill out reports that aren't going to do anything, but making sure people are aware of what's coming. So that's kind of how I would respond. So hopefully I've answered that, but let me know if I've missed the mark on your question.
No, I think you've answered it, but but the takeaway is that building owners need to be planning immediately for compliance, right? Even if it's not going to affect, and also whatever support services would be needed and or available would be needed immediately as well.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So I guess the last question I would just have is, what was the reason for the delay then? If essentially you need to start doing it right away, is it?
Well, what we've heard, and partly from this group, is that there were real concerns about a requirement in which you would have to upgrade equipment in the near term when your capital planning process and your funding process is of a longer time frame. And so while there is energy code, you're talking about equipment replacement at failure, but what building performance standards do is they also push upgrades to a building at a date certain, regardless of the state of equipment. And so the long delay allows for, actually fewer instances where you would have to replace equipment before its useful life was done. And it allows for a greater planning time frame and setting up the funding cycles for recapitalization or whatever funding opportunities. And it also allows more opportunity to get federal grants, to get funding. And, in my ideal vision of this is you have the regulation, which is the time frame is farther out, but you have dedicated focus on voluntarily decarbonizing, so that by the time you get to the regulation, there are, very few buildings that aren't prepared for it. If you all want us to have compliance earlier, we can do that, but
yeah, I think this is Alistair. I think one of the things to be careful about is maybe the languaging of it, because we don't want the delay to be something that people see as, oh, we don't have to worry about this now. We need the attention now, and we need the resources so that if somebody doesn't have to reach compliance until 2036, but actually they've got equipment they need to replace next year, that they recognize they need to do that upgrade to be compliant next year, not in 2036, and they're going to need the resources to get there, which raises one of the questions which came up in a conversation we were having last week, I think, is what's the applicability of utility incentives, and will they still be available once the BPS comes into force, or will the BPS count as a code requirement, which therefore negates utility incentives?
That's a great question. And also a great comment. I think you're spot on. It's like, it's not enough to just push it out like a compliance. There has to be dedicated outreach and support and make, awareness. And so what we did, I will say the example, the building tune-ups program. So commercial buildings, 50,000 square feet and larger needed to comply with or still need to comply to mandatory tune-ups. And so we were able to work with City Light on that to create a tune-up accelerator program in which City Light could provide incentives, and they actually really stepped up and created an incentive that was specific to building tune-ups on just a really simple per square foot basis. So it was a really straightforward incentive. And if owners complied early, so let's say they had to do their tune-up in 2020, if they complied in 2018 or 2019, they could get that incentive. So there's still a question about what happens when you get to, the year in which compliance is due. And there are, you're absolutely right. And Madeline might be able to weigh in here, but there are complexities around what utilities can provide. And so, but there are definitely voluntary, quote unquote, compliance, early compliance to put you in the place where, let's say you completely decarbonize, the building has gas, hot water heating, and you transition that to an electric heat pump. And then by 2036, you're fine. Also, and Madeline could speak to this, at the moment, Seattle City Light cannot incentivize fuel switching. So just noting that as well. So I don't know, Madeline, do you have anything to add there?
Yeah, I think probably everyone on this call knows this, but just to reiterate, our authority to provide incentives is through I-937, and it mandates that all utilities pursue all cost-effective resource acquisition. So like our authority is to reduce energy emission, or excuse me, to reduce energy consumption. And we can't pay for code compliance because it's no longer considered cost effective because it's mandated. And of course, there's exceptions to that, like in small businesses and certain other customer segments where it's been demonstrated that even if they need to go to code, they're not necessarily doing it. And so those are considered like high barrier customers. So there's certainly like some exceptions, but typically, when something becomes a rule, we can't incentivize it. This legislation here is, like Sandra pointed out, different because it's not specific to energy efficiency. It's in an area where we don't have authority to provide incentives at this time. But once that's why we're involved on this technical advisory group.
You can provide incentives if it's also efficiency.
Yeah, we can provide incentives on the efficiency portion of the project. But exactly what that will look like I can't say. That'll be determined by, once it's actually getting transmitted and is becoming official to understand kind of what portions of it we would be able to pay for and what portions of it would be considered just baseline compliance. But yeah, I like Sandra's point about an accelerator. We're always happy to support early compliance, and that's an area where utility incentives can generally play a good role.
Bobby?
Yeah, I have two things that I'm kind of curious about, and one is around incentives, so I'll start with that. I'm familiar with the limits on City Light's ability to incentivize certain types of projects, particularly fuel switching, because we've kind of run into that in my work at SHA with Office of Housing. And I'm curious, so I understand that City Light funds can't be used for that, but I imagine there are other revenue sources at the city that maybe could be made available for grant programs that could be packaged with some of the other funds that Office of Housing is administering. And I happen to sit on the customer review panel for Seattle Public Utilities, and I'm very familiar with an ongoing discussion that's been going on for years about the taxes that are baked into SPU's rates. If you're not familiar, there's a cap on the rates that City Light can charge to consumers. There's no such cap on Seattle Public Utilities rates. And this has been a longstanding issue on the review panel about where do those funds go and how are they accounted for and what programs do they support. The general answer is that they go into the general fund. But knowing just as a property owner or working for a property owner in the city and where a lot of our money goes from our operating budget, SPU is a huge part of our budget, and that 10 or 15% or whatever it is in tax revenue that SPU is collecting seems like a large amount of money that's coming from mostly property owners. And likely many of the people that are going to be affected by a policy like this one. So I guess I bring it up not so much as to instigate or pot stir, but kind of curious about, like, I know there are other sources of funds where I'd like to kind of, I guess, get some clarity about where will the funds come from. And I do think, to Steve's earlier point, having some baked in expectations about where those funds are going to come from is going to be really critical, especially for affordable housing. Like Sandra, I've said on the other advisory committee, like, I don't expect SHA to comply with this unless it's funded in part or entirely by government, and because we don't have funds of our own to make this happen. So it's more of a statement, less of a question, more of a statement. But the other one is about communication and awareness building. And I remember with the sugar tax, there was a lot of pre-communication before that policy went into place, particularly at point of sale. So convenience stores, all the places where you would buy a sugary or sweetened beverage. And at SHA, we have a lot of maintenance activities going on all the time, replacing hot water tanks, replacing equipment that could help us reach our goal if it were converted sooner. And I'm just wondering, do we have retailers or distributors at the table elsewhere where we're talking to them about this sort of pending policy and how they can help in reaching that goal? Because I know SHA, we spend a lot of money at Home Depot and Lowe's and a lot of the local hardware stores in the city. And those might be, as far as early adopter, that's like less official. We might be missing a communication loop there with the maintenance folks or trades folks that are, in their line of duty going out and buying the products that we maybe don't want them to be buying. So just I guess a thought, suggestion about that rollout and awareness building.
Yeah, thanks for those both comments, Bobby. We had not, City Light works more directly with distributors and retailers. We work with a distributor for our clean heat program for oil conversions. But that's a great thought on, sort of like where you buy it as a place for information.
Bobby, are you advocating for a Seattle City Light tax that could flow into the general fund to pay for incentives? Is that am I reading between the lines there?
I'm generally a pro-tax person, not a City Light tax. I'm saying there's already a lot of tax revenue coming in through SPU that's going right into the general fund. And I know a lot of it goes to housing and a lot of other programs. And hopefully the housing folks on the call don't want me to shut up. But it seems like maybe an untapped resource or a place to think about, where we could get some additional revenue to support these priorities. So.
Sort of a related question, Sandra. You talked about this ramp down of emissions. In this group, we've talked a lot about a prescriptive path for compliance, which might be, you have 3 or 4 main sources of emissions in a building and going to comply. And I wonder if there's been any thought about how that fits on that line, which is more like a step function, I guess, than a line.
Yeah.
And kind of related to that is your earlier comment. I think when you clarified my question about compliance timing, I think you explained it really well. And with what Bobby was saying also, that really describing it as there will be no forced replacement until 2036. But it's important that all end of life replacement immediately starts moving toward all electric. I think that's maybe more clear.
Yeah. And yes. And we are looking at alternative compliance prescriptive options, you know, for those cases where, like, I think especially in multifamily where, you know, the systems are, I mean, so many buildings, it's the hot water heating that will be the primary issue for emissions. I mean, efficiency, you still want to gain efficiency. And so could we perhaps, you know, maybe that first time you have to comply, if you replace your domestic hot water, then that's what you need to do. So it just, you know, you get the same result, you just don't have to do calculations. And we're also looking at it potentially for like small commercial rooftop, you know, gas pack units. Alistair.
Yeah, I've come back to this a couple of times and it comes up again, and now we're talking about revenue streams and so on. And I can't help thinking that given this delay and from the rollout that I've seen so far in the other group, the TAG group, we are now looking at pushing things out just because of the challenge of getting all this stuff together before 2026. We're kind of delaying the whole process to an uncomfortable degree at some level. And so it feels to me that the more we can bring resources to the table that will enable these early adoptions, so that particularly given that right now the equipment is probably more expensive, the installation is going to cost more because the market is still getting comfortable, that we ought to be able to figure out a way to monetize those early emissions reductions, right? That if our hard implementation is due in 26 or 30 or whatever it is, and we can incentivize people to actually switch out their gas boiler to a heat pump in 2022 or 2023, that there's some really tangible emissions reduction that comes from that. And somehow we ought to be able to monetize that. It's this kind of emissions bank utility idea that feels like there's got to be something there that we can use as a lever to get the market to move sooner.
Yeah, thank you. And it is the dilemma of like, we want emissions reductions now, and, you know, buildings and building asset management doesn't act on that time frame. But you know, like in order to monetize, we would have to find funding to monetize those early emissions reductions. But I mean, that's essentially, yeah, I don't think it's quite in line with what you're talking about. We are talking about, you know, a climate investment fund that could come from, you know, fines for one, but also, you know, payment in lieu, or I don't know. So I think that's worth discussing more, certainly.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I don't know if this is an interplay between the affordable housing and the market rate housing, because clearly on the tag, there's a tremendous amount of pushback on market rate developers who have just made substantial investments in equipment and they don't want to have to replace it until the end of its service life. And if they want that opportunity to extend their retrofit, then maybe they have to pay into a fund to buy that, and we can put that money into the affordable housing marketplace to get them to move sooner.
Yeah, thank you.
Sandra, this is Jen from OH, and I appreciate the conversation around revenue because this is such an important part, I think, of making this work for affordable housing. And one thing I just want to flag is that I don't feel that our current weatherizations funding, whether it's state, local, or let's say state through Matchmaker or federal, is particularly well set up for anything that involves fuel switching. The bias is definitely for like. And so we were just having this conversation today, Bobby and Daniel and I, about, you know, the conversations that we need to have, I think, with the Washington State Department of Commerce about how we're going to facilitate this funding being able to be used for fuel switching. I think there are some barriers. It's like allowable, but not easy. And there are some barriers that I can't help but feel are a little artificial. And so I think we are going to have to do some work to really, starting next year, if this legislation passes, right, we can't be encouraging people to do like for like anymore. We're going to have to support the fuel switching, and we're going to have to get our funding set up to be able to do that. And I think we're going to have some work to do with Commerce to get us into that position.
Absolutely. And I note too that, you know, Jen spearheaded the proposal to the Federal Department of Energy, and that part of that proposal was sort of recognizing some of the barriers that are sort of inherent in more typical weatherization.
And I do believe we're making some strides with Commerce about being able to include the cost of carbon when doing our savings to investment ratio calculations. So, you know, but that's slow progress, and some of that's going to need to hurry up, I think, if we're going to be able to make these things work in Seattle.
Yeah, good point. Steve.
I had a question, another discussion we've been having, and it just sparked a question for me, is about kind of electrification ready or electrification electric infrastructure, that a lot of the cost of compliance or electrifying is the cost of upgrading infrastructure. So panels and, you know, extending circuits to large equipment and so on. And that hopefully in time, the equipment itself won't be that much of a premium. You know, a heat pump water heater won't be much more than a gas boiler or et cetera. And it also relates to the idea of emergency replacement, that if, you know, if a water heater in a multifamily building goes out, you're going to want to replace it tomorrow, or you have residents, very unhappy residents. So I guess the question I have is really of incentives and funding for that, preparing buildings to electrify. And it occurred to me that, you know, Seattle City Light cannot incentivize the switching of appliances, but can they help provide the electric infrastructure for electrical appliances? Is that a nuance that
we're looking into everything, you know, that we can do within our authority to support building electrification? And I would just, you know, remind everyone, we are a nonprofit utility. So like anything we do, it's just reflecting the cost of service. So like the last thing we want to do is raise electric rates, because that would actually impact, you know, the business case of people electrifying in a negative way, where it would make, you know, electrification have a higher operating cost than other fuels. So like we don't want to raise all customer rates to be able to subsidize electrification for certain customers, is the standpoint right now. Because maybe higher electric rates would make it well, that's great feedback to have, because typically what we hear from our communities is please keep rates affordable, and that bills are already too high for a lot of folks. So this is a great place to provide that feedback, but our typical understanding is that folks want a sustainable, predictable rate path that does not have high year-over-year percentage increases on their rates. So I would say, Steve, yes, believe me, we're trying to look at every pathway we can to try to support this, because we know that those costs are going to be really significant and really hard to bridge, and there's not, you know, support out there right now to help bridge those costs. So we're trying to see ways that we can creatively help customers, but that's kind of the limit I would put on it right now, is that we don't want to have it lead to having to increase rates at some point. We're trying to leverage electrification to increase revenue so we can keep rates low.
I think that makes sense. Just a quick aside there. I think that makes total sense. And I would say that, you know, there are other jurisdictions around the country who have much higher electricity rates, who are pursuing electrification policies and efforts. So it's not a moot point, but it is something to consider, that the economics are still going to be rough no matter what. So it's like, right, you sort of figure out another way around the economics.
Well, and a lot of the utilities in California and New York, they're investor-owned utilities, and they're structured completely differently, where they are incentivized to build more infrastructure. Sure. That's how they get their rate of return. And so they're like Puget Sound Energy. And so they're in a very different boat than nonprofit utilities are, where it's like the money has to come from somewhere. It comes from rates, and that's it. We don't have shareholders and, and other things with guaranteed rate of returns and a UTC.
If energy burden is somewhat inequitable today, in that low-income residents or moderate-income residents or affordable housing or under-resourced buildings bear a larger burden in energy, then sustaining the current rate structure sustains that inequity. So I just think we need to look at it from multiple perspectives, and that supporting those communities to become more efficient, even if it costs more for the rest of the ratepayers, is potentially a more equitable thing to do, if not a happy thing for most of your ratepayers. I certainly understand that. And I understand why the utility would be hesitant to do that, avoids that, but there is an equity concern here, I think, too.
I want more information on that point, Steve. Not necessarily in this forum, but I mean, this is like, we're actively debating this at City Light too, because this is our future, is all electrification. And so we're trying to support it in ways that we can. And that's the most feedback we get typically is on rates, and people, want to keep them as low as possible. And they've gone up a lot in recent years, even though they're still some of the cheapest in the country. They've been going up at a pretty fast rate.
I would just say the concern should be about electric bills, not
yes.
rates. And
sorry.
How do we impact
bills? Have gone up too. Thank you. Sorry, I'll let someone else speak. Alistair.
Well, I wanted to, this raises this issue of burden and equity, raises another issue for me, which is a bit of a curve in the current conversation. But at some point, I did want to revisit the issue about the focus in the multifamily realm versus single family. And I know Bobby will probably give me a quiet cheer for this, for raising it. And having thought about this to some extent, I've always sort of found it kind of challenging to figure out how we might approach that. But it has kind of struck me that, we have a major portion of the housing inventory that's single family, which is egregious in its rate of emissions, and yet is really hard to target. And multifamily buildings are so much easier to target from that point of view. And then as I've been watching what's going on in Seattle, I'm recognizing that actually a lot of those single family homes are increasingly owned by a small collection of private equity landholders. And should we be looking at portfolio single family homeowners and saying, if you own 20,000 square feet of single family, you fall under this building performance standard and you have to bring your properties into compliance? Just a thought.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting thought. We did it, and I will say that we are not, we are assuming that single family needs to be addressed as well. We are not getting to where we need to go on this policy alone. So it's an and just at the moment, this is the focus. But also some of the Green New Deal Oversight Board recommendations sort of are, there's recommendations around addressing single family and even single family rental in particular. So that's great. I mean, and, I just, some of this, another, like that whole like portfolio, if you own more than 20,000, I don't know, are they actually equity owners? I thought they were selling them off, but that could be another, right?
Yeah, well, no, I think actually there are certainly some private equity groups that have discovered that although they purchased these properties with the intent to flip them, that they've discovered that actually the rental business is a really good business to be in. So I think it's a mix, but I think there are quite a lot of pretty large property holders, who are contributing to our problem.
I think I will say just, logistically, politically, like we wouldn't be adding them into this legislation at this point in time, right? I think that, but that does not preclude sort of what you're talking about is like down the line, is there some approach that recognizes the big owners? The other just note, I mean, knowing that we need to address single family writ large and smaller multifamily writ large too, is, you know, we've talked about like, could you get emissions reductions, you know, like an owner who doesn't want to change out their equipment pays into a climate investment fund, and those funds could be used. They could, if you could get the same emissions reductions by funding upgrades in 10 lower income single family homes, you know? Like we want the emissions reductions. They'd be the same if it's from a single family house, you know. I mean, so that's an option potentially too, in terms of thinking about how we might use any sort of a fund.
But long term, don't we need both, really?
Exactly, exactly. Yeah, there's no either or there. It's sort of like it all needs to happen. First. And I think, you know, to Alistair's point, you know, it's like we sort of in the green building realm, we sort of start with the, you know, more bang for your buck, bigger properties, but in aggregate, single family, you know, even each individual building, you add it up and it's almost half of our building related emissions. So.
Yeah, it's interesting. Somebody who knows finance better, it'd be interesting to look at, you know, what the economic picture looks like in terms of the net present value of the money and of an activity now versus if you're able to defer it by 15 years, and, you know, what the likely change in the cost of the upgrades are and so on and so forth. I mean, I think that there's some interesting stuff to play with there. That, yeah, it's probably a dream for a consultant who can wrap their heads around that.
Someone like 360?
Maybe. I'll call the brains in our firm and see if they can figure that out.
I'm just wondering if anyone who hasn't spoken once has a question or comment on what Sandra's presented so far. I guess not. Okay. So we've sort of moved into the next part of our agenda anyway, which are some of these general discussions, and we probably hit upon, talked about the first one a little bit. The first question we teed up is around prescriptive versus an emissions pathway. And in our initial work, we've listed it as an alternative compliance path without really defining what that means. So one of the things we thought we wanted to talk about a little bit, to ask if you all think, what you all think about that prescriptive path, and should it be the preferred compliance path for affordable housing, for example, rather than an alternative, or is it just a complete either or and they're just both pathways to compliance? So, you know, alternatives sometimes require, Sandra, correct me, an application, exception. Is this an exception, or is it just you do A or B and you have your choice? So I wanted to just raise that issue and see if people had thoughts about that. Or Sandra, if you have thoughts about that.
I just know you are right. I mean, typically we call it alternative. There's sort of an application that I am going to take this approach instead of that. But so we can think about that internally too, about sort of, you know, ease of, you know, use of a particular pathway.
So maybe we called it multiple compliance pathways for affordable housing.
Yeah, I think, you know, with a little insight from the building audit work that we're doing on this at the moment, typically, you know, what we're seeing is that the equipment in question is limited to 1 or 2 or 3 large pieces of plant in a building. And so there isn't very much incremental upgrade opportunity. We're mostly doing all of it in one chunk, or we're doing it in two separate chunks. So I think the sort of prescriptive option just simplifies things in a lot of ways. Of course, the reality is that then there are always situations where somebody wants to try something different. I mean, there are definitely buildings that have envelope upgrade opportunities, but those generally become quite costly in and of themselves. And so that might be something that happens in a more iterative way, but that would be somewhat different. The other thing that maybe relates to both the early mover, the early adopter, and this idea of the prescriptive path is the exposure to the substantial alteration clause in the code, that one of the things that will deter housing owners from making a major step is if it's going to trigger the substantial alteration threshold for them and result in a whole lot of other code compliance issues that they wouldn't be able to afford. So whether there's some way to carve out, a special clause that says if you're just doing this, then you're not exposing yourself to that. And I know there is some flexibility in the code to accommodate that in certain situations, but it does seem to me that might be something to make sure that in the event somebody's wanting to do an upgrade and they can't, or if they do, it's going to mean they also have to do 12 other things in order to come in compliance with the code. Finding a way around that might really help people to make a short-term step or a step in the near term rather than pushing things out into the future.
Alistair, can you remind everyone what triggers that substantial alteration in the code?
Yeah, no, I can't. I don't know the code language off the top of my head.
I think I can. I may get the numbers wrong, which is a big deal, but it's either 2 or 3 of your major systems.
Yeah.
If you change, I forgot if it's 2 or 3. You change one of the 2 or 3, then you trigger, it becomes a substantial alteration, and then you need to do all your lighting and ventilation and shell, everything.
Yeah.
So I think that's a good point, and I think I think changing code or amending the code rather than having to get an exception every time you do that would be the simplest pathway for the affordable housing folks. If and maybe amending it to say, if you are electrifying and reducing emissions or reducing energy use, you're exempt from the substantial alterations clause or something like that.
And Ellen's providing a whole lot of useful additional comments on the sub-alt requirements. I suspect because they've just had to go through it quite recently.
And I just, in some informal conversations I've had with SDCI, I think they've recognized too, they're also grappling with what something like this would mean for triggering substantial alterations, right? And, understanding that, the position that it puts property owners in to have substantial alterations triggered by something that is no longer optional, but a requirement. And so, Sandra, I wonder if that's a conversation that we want to have with SDCI internally as well, because I do think they're grappling with the consequences and what the path forward is here as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And we are having those conversations. I can't, I think, I will just note that, SDCI is in a position in which, they do not want to sort of limit life safety improvements, right? So it's a tenuous position about like, well, okay, you didn't have to do this, and so then your exit pathway wasn't improved, and therefore there was a fire. So we're talking life safety systems. So you can sort of understand some of the concerns. And yes, I think, this whole idea, especially I think too, there's sort of 2 things. There's one is the fear of substantial alteration when so many things do not trigger it. So like getting some clarity around, like, if you replace your domestic hot water system, that shouldn't trigger substantial alteration. But if you do it combined with something, right? So getting some clarity there, and also, you know, sort of when is it okay to, you know, sort of allow, like you said, if it's a requirement, when is it okay for that requirement to take place without upgrading the entire building to code? So,
you know, my impression is the idea of substantial alteration was you're doing a major remodel to the building and you have multiple trades on site, and that you're getting big financing, and that when you do all that, you should bring your building up to new code. And that, I think that makes sense. But replacing two mechanical systems, especially when you're required to, seems quite different than that intent. So anyway. Okay, any more comments on that? So another question that came up, and others may have to help me figure out what I'm asking here a little bit, but there was some questions around the interaction between the state efficiency requirements down the road and the city's emission targets and the timing of them. You know, that is it, I think the issues are maybe, is it possible to comply with an emissions target because you have an all electric building, but it may be quite inefficient. And then you don't comply with the state code, which is around efficiency, and getting those two to line up and to consider them together could be complex for some buildings. And I'm not expressing this well, but might lead to decision-making that isn't most effective to achieve either goal, or and could be quite expensive. So Alistair, maybe help me out on this, because I think you were part of that discussion.
Yeah. And I mean, I think you're hitting it. I think that was the issue, was because of this question about emissions versus efficiency, there are a whole lot of all electric buildings who might well be able to meet the emissions requirement, but will fall under, if the state goes ahead and includes multifamily buildings in their building performance standard, that they would then at some point in the future then find that they're under an efficiency requirement. That was the essence of the conversation. And I guess the question was, to what extent is the city able to advocate to the state for, you know, good alignment of those things?
So from a planning perspective for a housing owner,
yeah,
planning these two requirements that may not line up well in some cases, and even if the timing is similar. I know, Sandra, you mentioned you were going to try to work the timing so that it aligns.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the city, will be involved in the rulemaking, definitely, for this, you know, in response to the latest legislation. And to, you know, we do talk to the state about, you know, overlap. So I think it's always this sort of tensions, like who goes first and decides what, and then who comes on, and, you know, and sometimes we just, like, you know, like for instance, the sizes of the buildings, the size cohorts of ours for building tune-ups, we had 200,000 and above. The state sets it at over 220,000. So we'll just use whatever the state uses. Right. And, you know, down the line, I think we are talking about in the legislation how we can make sure that we can adapt if, as rulemaking progresses for the state's energy standards for the tier 2 buildings, we need to adjust, we can, but we will also be very involved in rulemaking. And I know that's not a very satisfying answer, but we're kind of in the same position in some ways. It's like, we will advocate for the state work to align with whatever the city is. And I think you're right. There's a certain point at which, like, an all electric building isn't going to be impacted by an emissions target. So it's sort of like they're not impacted until the state standard kicks in, but there's no reason there can't be voluntary efficiency upgrades. But until you know what the state's going to require, you're kind of, you know, you're in that little bit of a limbo. I don't know. Not a great answer, but we will do our darndest to make sure everything aligns as much as it can.
Great. The other question I think we've addressed is the alignment between the start of compliance, implementation of measures, and funding and services. And I think we pretty much concluded that implementation of measures, replacements at end of life, and funding and services need to happen as soon as possible, even though compliance is out at 2036 potentially. And that we need to communicate that clearly with some of the feedback. Any other comments on that before we move on? Okay, I think we just have a couple of other questions that are more specific to the city. Around the services provided by the city potentially, or requested, or rosters, we talked about a lot of things. We talked about help with community needs assessments, help with energy audits or electrification assessments, and so on. The question was, how specific should our ask or request be? So should there be sort of scopes that are defined and somewhat regulated by the city for best practices or standard practices? Should fees be established, either guaranteed if someone's on the city roster, or a range or published in some way? So how, just want to get a discussion a little more about what exactly does the affordable housing community desire in the details of having services available to help with, especially the planning and assessment and all of the processes we're going to have to engage in to comply with this policy.
So if I could comment on the challenge of having a set fee or range, is that the different developers or groups or people are going to have different levels of expertise. So they're going to need different levels of help. Some may need everything. They're starting from scratch. Some may have multiple projects going on at the same time. And so they may have more resources to support this implementation. So I would, and then each building is going to be different, right? It's going to be different for a smaller project or an older building versus a new. So I'd caution about having an expectation of fitting what we want to see within a specific range. Those are my initial thoughts. So.
Thanks, Ryan. Other thoughts? Sandra, I wonder if you could share with this group in the tune-up world. I know certain kinds of organizations are qualified to do tune-ups. How does that work, and how do fees work? And is there a model that you're looking at that works to replicate if certain services are available or rosters are available for this kind of work?
Yeah. So one thing I will just caution is that the city is limited in its ability to recommend private contractors. So it doesn't mean that can't be something that couldn't be set up in some way, shape, or form, but it's possible that that particular recommendation may not be legally doable by the city. We do with the building tune-ups, what we have are requirements in the legislation and the rule for who is considered a building tune-up specialist and what kind of experience and certification they need. So, there's a list of, certain, types of certifications that are applicable, numbers of years of experience, and then that is the tune-up specialist who is allowed to sign off on having done the work of the building tune-up. And that can be a independent contractor, it can be an in-house person who works in the building, but they have to have a certain credentials, if you will. We do not get into the business of regulating any fees.
Have there been any comments from building owners about affordability of tune-up specialists? Is there a competitive marketplace sort of, or any feedback that might be helpful for us?
I'm not sure I have enough information to answer that. Probably Rebecca, who runs that program, would be a better person to ask. I do, my impression is there is a competitive marketplace, and there's also differences in the quality of the work.
Sure. Okay. I think we had one more question, and we've touched on this a little bit. Let me just see if there's any more feedback. We were questioning whether it's a valid assumption that as equipment fails and get replaced, is the expectation for affordable housing. And that sort of touches on this 2036 compliance that, if I'm understanding Sandra correctly, that at 2036, whether the equipment has failed or not, if you're not in compliance, whether that's prescriptive or emissions based, you would need to comply wherever the standard is at 2036 or thereafter, right? So, one other, let me just throw out, one thought would be that for affordable housing, which is strapped for funding, it could be, you only need to replace it at end of life. From a climate standpoint, that runs certain risk of really old equipment being in buildings for a really long time, but it would take away that replacement cost. At some point, hopefully replacing that equipment is the logical thing to do because it's more efficient and costs will come down. But that's something we haven't really built into our recommendations, and I want to get feedback on that if people have thoughts either way. So Ellen put in the chat that supports the idea. I'm assuming that means of saying you do need to, at time of failure, you do need to meet compliance, but potentially if your equipment hasn't failed, you don't. And that could be an exception for affordable housing, potentially, that is requested. Other thoughts on that?
Steve, would you say that that's substantially different than having a start, essentially a start date of 2036? I mean, does the start date of 2036 essentially leave you in the same situation where most folks will be replacing when the equipment is at the end of its natural life?
I would ask your friend, Dan. I've seen 60-year-old boilers in buildings, right? So there is some equipment that lasts, 2036 would mean that most equipment would last another 15 years. And that anything that lasts longer than that, if the building isn't in compliance, generally would need to be replaced. And Sandra, you also mentioned the portfolio option. That could be another option for that. But I think Dan or someone who works with equipment more, I mean, I think the expected life of some of the older gas equipment or even newer gas equipment is pretty long.
Yeah, the old non-condensing equipment, the pork chop boilers, those could last for 40 years easily. And the condensing ones, I think they've increased how long those can last.
So Jen, it sounds like yes and no. There could be some things that are working okay, and this policy would force replacement. And you know, I mean, there's also an environmental issue there. I mean, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of emissions to make equipment. So, at some point at which forcing replacement of equipment that is still working may not be gaining us globally, at least all the emissions savings we think we're getting. I don't know what that calculation is, but I think it's something else to consider. Alice, are you about to speak?
I was thinking about it. Yeah, it's a complicated one, and I know we've had some of these conversations in a slightly different context, just thinking about the situations where the cost effectiveness of the upgrade in terms of emissions saved is one of the considerations, right? Whether you can expand that into the embodied emissions in the equipment that's a pretty challenging one at the moment, but there is definitely a case there. I don't know whether anybody else, any other jurisdictions are looking at it from that point of view, or whether in any of the other kind of think tanks on this issue are exploring that. It would be something to look at. I mean, I've talked about it in the context of when you've got brand new high efficiency condensing boilers just installed in a building. Where is the watershed there between allowing that relatively low emission piece of equipment to run its useful life versus switching it out to an electric heat pump? And, you know, is there any real possibility that 10 years down the road that there will be some viable renewable natural gas solution? Excuse my friend passing through.
Oh, don't go down that road.
So, yeah, or could they be switched over to hydrogen, right? I mean, there are a bunch of variables that there is a little bit of me that worries that the heat pump is actually the CFL of the space conditioning world.
Well, I have to say, with 10 minutes left in this meeting, not quite sure what trajectory that thinking's going to take us to. But just giving you all, we're at a 10 minutes heads up. So letting us know that if there's something that's been on top of our mind or more that we need to address that's specific in the list, Steve, you got 10 minutes.
I had one question for Sandra, I guess, a little bit. You know, for all of you, one of the things we've talked about is some buildings that may just need exemptions. You know, an old hydronic heating system in a 10-story building that, you know, upgrading. You know, Ryan, you worked on the Cambridge apartments, I think, right? And I think that was a case, that's an old hydronic system and it was upgraded to a new hydronic system, but I think replacing it with electric was considered, and it was just millions of dollars, if I recall. So where's that line? Is that a consideration that some buildings will just not need to comply? And what kind of standard or assessment would be necessary to determine what that is? And when is it just not affordable to do this in some buildings?
There will always be, we try and phrase it more as extensions as opposed to exemptions for financial financial hardship or conditions which are just infeasible. And I don't know where that line is. I don't think any of us know yet, honestly. I think one thing to consider is if we are successful in reducing emissions and transitioning our buildings to cleaner energy sources, the cost of operations for any particular building that remains on an older system could be astronomical. So, right, if there is no longer in a 2045 future a large gas distribution system, because we have transitioned most of our buildings off of gas, and the Cambridge is the one lone building, I just can't imagine what PSE's rates would be for that. So that just,
but then it becomes cost effective at some point.
Well,
right?
There you go. It becomes cost effective.
I guess one of the questions would be, if there is some line in the legislation, in the rulemaking, maybe more likely, should there be a different line for affordable housing? Should there be more understanding that affordable housing is has limited more options of raising funds, has really no options of raising more funds through rent and so on, that what is considered a hardship is different for this community than for the commercial community generally. So maybe we just ask for that consideration.
That could be. I will say we have heard from some other cities, Boston, DC, New York City, actually, where there's been real pushback from community groups that you are, by sort of exempting affordable housing, you create a second-class tier of buildings that don't receive these upgrades, and so there's always that, like, when will that economic hardship hit? If there's going to be an economic hardship, and it's going to hit sooner or later. And so, which goes always back to, let's see what we can do to help. As sort of like the timing of the regulation is one thing, but the most important thing is like trying to find the funding to help transition, affordable housing as needed. And you're right, there's a certain cost effectiveness point at which the Cambridge would probably not be the first building that we, wanted to fund, because nobody would have enough funding for it.
You talk about a line. I will say on that project, the line was what was required for code. There tends to be a want or a wish list of things we'd like to do, but when it comes down to it, is with the amount of funding that actually is received, then it's, we got to do this. That's the bare minimum. And there's not much left over to do anything above that line, if you will. So.
Yep. Okay. Anyone have any last issues? I think this was a good discussion. I think we'll try to integrate these into the sort of final recommendations for input. To go to the Office of Sustainability and hopefully get some feedback back on them and see them surface in the legislation, the draft legislation.
Bring up one thing we had in the list that came up in the Learn and Lunch. Just because, Sandra, you were talking about, yes, we're submitting to OSE, but of course we could also submit independently to the mayor or to anyone who wants to accept our submittal, I guess. But there was a question that came up in the Learn and Lunch about should we request that the city assist with a quicker procurement process or prioritize the assessment reviews that might happen in any federal funding applications? And I guess I'm kind of wondering, does asking the city to do something like that, yes, the city can make a statement in something, but what does it mean? But you were talking about pursuing federal funding. And so I'm wondering if that might be an important element to put in.
I'm not completely sure I understand the recommendation. I won't comment, but also if others have comments, please go ahead, because you.
Well, and I do remember from the person who brought it up, they were basically saying that the federal compliance and federal rules are saying, you know, you have to have this particular level in who's going to be hired to do the work and who's going to, you know, so they were talking about there are different levels that the Fed is asking for. And so the procurement process gets delayed. The prioritizing of assessment reviews would be more delayed in that system. Is there a way to say, well, since this is affordable housing and this is a little bit, you know, we're already doing this pathway together and this is an urgent need, is that some way that it can be influenced? Does the city have any leverage there?
Does the city have any leverage on the federal government is kind of what I'm hearing. And so I hope, I think, I don't know, honestly. That's a good question.
Yeah, that's why I was saying, you know, asking you to ask somebody, I'm not sure what that does. But when you were talking about federal funding, I thought, well, maybe there's something about the way that you communicate together that does leave some kind of alley open there for that consideration about prioritization, because every time that everything is reviewed or delayed, it's going to land up.
Yeah, I mean, and absolutely, we can communicate, you know, and to the extent that we might be in you know, conversations with the federal government, absolutely.
I just wanted to make sure that we got that out there since it did come through. And then I think we're pretty good. We're at 3:30, big conversation here. Remember, we do have one final meeting. If anyone can make it, it will be on June 30th. If not, you will see it post on the website and I will send out notes. But if you can be there, that would be great. And then of course, June 16th, which is tomorrow, that is OSE's open house. So if you're able to attend that, you will get a much broader viewpoint on exactly where they are in their process and what they're thinking about in terms of their recommendations. So if you can be a voice in that room, that's always helpful. Thank you all for coming in today.